Hey everybody, what's a crack-a-lackin'? We're going to begin our study of the early Cold War today, picking up right where we left off at the end of World War II, and going right up until about 1960 or so. So let's start by looking at some of the new agreements and new treaties and new organizations that were formed by the Allies following the defeat of the Axis powers and the end of the Second World War. Recall Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations. Remember how much of a failure it had been? And Woodrow Wilson wasn't even a part of it. It failed because it lacked the necessary mechanism of enforcement, like an army, right? And so when Germany starts to push around Czechoslovakia or Poland, they really can't say anything to stop him. And it also failed because of the lack of American participation, rendered it almost pointless in a post-World War I international scenario. Well, two devastating world wars, one in 1914 through 1918, and the other in 1931 through 1945, demonstrated the necessity of forming some kind of international peacekeeping organization. And so this time in 1945, the United States, both Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, led the way in the promotion and the creation of the United Nations, an international peacekeeping organization based on the principles of the Atlantic Charter, which was that document that Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt had committed themselves to on that secret meeting off the coast of Newfoundland in August of 1941. The UN would not be based on the equality of nations, as the League of Nations had proposed to be, but it's more of a realistic organization. It's based on the reality that the center of gravity is held by five major powers: the United States, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China. In 1945, the five great powers are going to hold permanent seats on the Security Council, and they hold those seats today. The Security Council is that board which reviews whether or not aggressive action, whether or not the United Nations is going to approve and endorse aggressive action to contain a problem nation. All member nations in the General Assembly have a voice in international affairs, however. The primary goal of the UN is to prevent international wars such as the two we have just seen, and also future atrocities like the Nazi Holocaust, which is becoming more and more evident as the Nazi horrors unfold. So the new president, Harry Truman, who succeeded Franklin Roosevelt in 1945, appoints Franklin Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor, to represent the United States at the First Assembly of the United Nations in New York. Ms. Roosevelt actually has a very bold idea for the future of the world. She is elected as chair of the Commission on Human Rights, and she guides the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is completed and adopted by the United Nations in 1948. It is a bold declaration of human equality and human rights throughout the planet. The Declaration of Human Rights reads in part, "Recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. All human beings born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood." It also condemns slavery and torture. It upholds freedom of religion. And it maintains that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being for himself and his family. The first challenge of the United Nations is to deal with the problem of the Holocaust, because after the fall of Germany, the Allies liberated the Nazi death camps. Now, people had known that something had been going on in Germany. People had known that there was some atrocities being committed against Jews in a major way. But this is nothing new to the world's understanding. Atrocities have always happened, and atrocities have often happened to Jews. And so while nobody condemned what had been happening, the full horror of what becomes known as the Holocaust is not yet known. And when Dwight D. Eisenhower, one of the American generals, who liberates the death camps in Germany and Poland, sees what is happening, he is absolutely astonished. And one of the questions confronting the new United Nations is, how do we deal with this atrocity? Well, a series of trials are going to be held in Nuremberg, which is the city in which Jews were originally stripped of their citizenship by the Nuremberg laws in 1935. The Nuremberg Trials are to be held by the UN, in which the Allies tried leading Nazis for their crimes, especially crimes such as the Holocaust. But the legal question arises, how do you prosecute someone for a crime that does not technically exist? Now, this is a very slippery slope, because the defendant said, well, I was just following orders. I was a soldier, soldiers take orders, and I do what my superiors tell me. Robert Jackson, one of the American prosecutors, does not accept this explanation of their actions. He says, no half-century ever witnessed slaughter on such a scale, such cruelties and inhumanities. If we cannot eliminate the causes and prevent the repetition of these barbaric events, it is not an irresponsible prophecy to say that the 20th century may yet succeed in bringing the doom of civilization. Essentially, what the UN prosecutors argue is that you cannot appeal to the fact that you were just following orders, because you should have known that what you were doing was wrong. And that's a philosophy question. Well, how do I know what wrong is? What's right and what's wrong? What is our authority for right and wrong? Is it me? Is it you? Is it God? And essentially, what the Nuremberg trials say is, there is a higher authority. It's higher than the courts of men. And you are going to have to answer to that authority. Now, we are not that authority, but we're damn sure going to punish you for what you have done. A new order is a new economic order. What you're looking at there is a picture of delegates who met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. See, during World War II, the Allied nations met at Bretton Woods to discuss the formation of an economic alliance that would hopefully prevent another Great Depression. The U.S. pushed for an establishment of an International Monetary Fund, otherwise known as the IMF, and a World Bank. The goal of these two organizations was to make funding available for developing nations so that they could jumpstart their economies and feed their citizens, and also to regulate international fiat money by anchoring it to the US dollar. And you'll recall what fiat money is. Fiat money is money that is not based on a precious metal, but is essentially valuable by government decree. And so this is a move toward internationalizing the world economy and monitoring it to the extent for the purpose that we will no longer have another Great Depression. And so these are the nations, the U.S., Great Britain, France, Norway, Brazil, Chile, India, and Australia, that all signed what is called GATT in 1947, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It is designed to reverse the train wreck that was the Hawley-Smoot Tariff of 1931, which you recall Herbert Hoover approved in a misguided attempt to try to stop the Great Depression, to protect domestic industry. And what it did, in fact, was it caused other nations to raise their tariffs, and it crippled international trade. So between 1947 and 1993, GATT has successfully reduced international tariffs from an average of 40% to 5%. So this is the forerunner of what became known as the European Union in Europe and NAFTA in the Americas. And we should point out that the Republican Party no longer loves its high tariffs as it did in the 19th century and through the early 20th centuries. We'll take just a minute and point out some of the differences that exist between the American system of government and politics and that existed in the Soviet Union. The American nation is a constitutional republic. Ultimate power rests with the people and is expressed through the people's representatives in Congress. Now, the Soviet Union is not like that at all, or was not like that when it existed. It is an authoritarian dictatorship, and the power is in the ruling party in the government, and there is only one party that's legal. In the United States, we have a mixed economy, which is directed by supply and demand, which determines price and output. In the Soviet Union, they are a command economy, a communist economy, in which prices and output are determined not by supply and demand, but by the government. In the United States, we recognize individual freedoms, such as those enumerated by the Bill of Rights. In the Soviet Union, they do not recognize individual rights, at least not to the extent that the United States does. Power, again, rests not with the people and not with a constitution. It rests with the ruling party in the government. In the United States, labor unions negotiate openly with businesses. However, in the Soviet Union, labor unions are owned and operated by the state, as is all industry. Disputes are settled by the state. So do you remember when we were friends with the Soviet Union? Remember when we teamed up with our ally, the Soviet Union, for the purpose of defeating Nazism and defeating Hitler? We called Stalin Uncle Joe back then. No joke. And do you remember what Stalin most wanted from Britain and the United States after Operation Barbarossa? That is, after Hitler abandoned his pact with the Soviet Union and attacked them in 1941? Stalin wanted that second front. Stalin wanted that second front so badly. Please open up another theater of operations somewhere in Western Europe so that we can take the pressure off of the East, because Soviet soldiers are doing the brunt of the fighting in Europe. When did Stalin actually get that second front? Because Operation Barbarossa was the 22nd of June, 1941. Stalin got his front on June 6, 1944, which was the D-Day invasion. So there are the big three, Churchill, FDR, and Stalin. And Stalin's asking, how long did you plan to let me bleed, comrade? Winston Churchill recalled in his memoirs on the German invasion of the Soviet Union, he said, if we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia. And that if we see Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany. And that way, let them kill as many as possible. Also, we need to consider that Russia has been invaded from the West 3 times. By France, there's Napoleon in 1812, by Germany in 1914, and Germany again in 1941. What most concerns Stalin? What does Stalin really want to see? He wants to see security from the West. So at the Yalta Conference, which took place in February of 1945, Stalin declares, Poland, remember when Hitler took over Poland and, I liberated Poland and most of Eastern Europe? Well, I'm going to go ahead and keep those for myself. What do you think about that, comrade? And so this is what the post-war world is shaping up to look like. The Soviet Union in the East and the Western democracies to the West. And what of the liberated countries that Hitler had taken over and Stalin had helped to liberate? The Soviet flag now flies over them, and he is not going to permit them to have open and free elections. He is not going to permit them to engage in a capitalist style of economic system. In fact, he's going to maintain those for his own security, and he's going to rule over them as satellite nations. To the United States, and gives a speech in Missouri, which becomes famous. It's called the Iron Curtain speech. He says, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and all the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. And all are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high, and in some cases increasingly measure of control from Moscow. So with these heightened tensions between the communist East and the free and democratic West, the stage is set for a showdown. When two revolutions break out in both Greece and Turkey, they seem to be leftist revolutions. They seem oriented toward a command economy and not toward a free market or free enterprise capitalist economy. Harry Truman sounds the alarm and declares that communism is beginning to spread throughout Europe. Harry Truman goes before Congress in 1947, and he asks a very largely Republican Congress, and keep in mind, Harry Truman is a Democrat. He asks them for $400 million in foreign aid to put down these rebellions in Greece and Turkey. And the Republicans look at him and say, "Are you absolutely crazy? The New Deal, World War II, and now you're asking for more money." See, the Republicans who had taken over Congress, they had been largely elected to Congress in 1946, were hoping to reverse the New Deal and were hoping to bring the budget back into equilibrium, to balance it. And here's Harry Truman going, "I want to spend more." Well, Harry Truman knows he's going to have a tough battle with the Republicans. And so he says this: "At the present moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. One way of life is based on the majority, the will of the majority, and is distinguished by free institutions, representative government, free elections, guarantees of individual liberty, freedom of speech and religion, and freedom from political oppression." That'd be us. "The second way of life is based upon the will of a minority, forcibly imposed upon the majority. It relies upon terror and oppression, a controlled press and radio, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedoms. I believe," now pay attention to this last part, "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." Now this becomes known as the Truman Doctrine of 1947. It is the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting communism. Now the Truman Doctrine actually owes a lot to the work of another man named George Kennan. George Kennan was a writer who called himself X, and he publishes The Sources of Soviet Conduct. Now, it turned out to be George Kennan, who was an American diplomat to the USSR. And the article that he publishes becomes known as Article X. And this is the document that's going to inform American foreign policy toward the Soviet Union all the way up and through the Vietnam War. He writes, "We are going to continue for a long time to find the Russians difficult to deal with. It does not mean that they should be considered as embarked upon a do-or-die program to overthrow our society by a given date. The theory of inevitability of the eventual fall of capitalism has the fortunate connotation that there is no hurry about it. In these circumstances, it is clear that the main element of any United States policy toward the Soviet Union must be that of a long-term, patient, but firm, and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendency." Read that last part again. The policy of the United States must be patient and firm containment of Russian expansive policies. This is how American diplomats and American presidents and American military leaders are going to see the objectives of the Soviet Union all the way up until, really, Richard Nixon. They're relentlessly expansionist, and they believe that capitalism will be one day defeated. They are not in a hurry, but they are bent on expansion, and it must be our policy to oppose that expansion. It's called containment. Look at the destruction of Europe. That's Berlin in 1945. Doesn't look like a place you'd want to move in, does it? That's Warsaw, 1945, which is now under the Soviet sphere. That's Dresden in Germany, 1945. That destruction was done by strategic bombing and area bombing during the Second World War. Secretary of State George C. Marshall, United States Secretary of State, declares that America has to do something about this devastation in Europe. America must do something about the starvation and the desperation that now prevails in war-torn Europe. So Marshall goes before Congress and he says, "It is logical that the United States should do whatever it is able to do to assist in the return of normal economic health of the world, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace. Our policy is not directed against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos." So that's George C. Marshall, Secretary of State under Truman, and he delivers a speech at Harvard in which he calls for just this: massive financial aid to war-torn Europe. This becomes the basis for what later is known as the Marshall Plan. So there's the Congress in 1948 hearing out George C. Kennan's plan. And they approve the Marshall Plan. What is it? It's a whole lot of money. $13 billion in cash to jumpstart the European economy. The nations that are granted financial aid from the United States under the Marshall Plan. Look at all the yellow ones. Most of Western Europe. Marshall aid recipient with amount in U.S. dollars. Look at that. United Kingdom, $3.2 billion from the United States. France, $2.7 billion from the United States. West Germany, $1.4 from the United States. You see, Germany's been divided. We'll get to that in a minute. Even Italy, $1.5 billion from the United States. Ireland, Turkey, Greece, Norway, Sweden, Belgium. Look at these countries. All receiving great big welfare checks from the United States. Now you're asking, so this is a humanitarian mission then? This is just to help starving children? Are there no strings attached to the Marshall Plan? Of course not. Don't be so idealistic. The Marshall Plan is contingent. Receiving Marshall Plan aid is contingent upon capitalist development oriented in a way that favors the United States. Now, come on, can we expect anything different? We're not going to give out billions of dollars to Western Europe without expecting that it's going to eventually aid the development of our own economy. U.S. companies are to be the primary recipients of Marshall Plan development. Okay, so here's how this works. The folks in Europe are going to need things. They're going to need consumer goods. They're not going to need hydroelectric power. They're going to need engineers. They're going to need milk. They're going to need diapers. They're going to need pizza. They're going to need whatever they're going to need. U.S. companies are going to be the ones that receive the American aid, the federal dollars, defense contracts essentially. And the companies will be the ones to supply the goods. So critics later claim that this is a form of economic imperialism. Come on now. You can't let Europe sink into a cesspool. It would turn communist. Starving people turn communist. It happens. I can prove this. I'll get out my Etch-a-Sketch. I'll do the math and I'll show you. Hungry people find communism much more appealing than free markets. The United States is not about to let this happen. Nations receiving the money are expected to adopt military and domestic policies to counter Soviet influence. So the Marshall Plan is both. It's both humanitarian, yes, it feeds people, it keeps people from starving, don't forget this. But it's also diplomatic. It is designed to prevent hungry people from turning to Soviet influence to feed them. Fuel, 16%. 14% of Marshall Plan aid was in the form of transportation. Raw materials to jumpstart factories, 38%. And then, no small donation, was 32% food and produce. So there's the Marshall Plan windmill, providing all sorts of economic and social benefit for Europe. And so you ask, what is Stalin doing through all of this? Look at my cartoon. Here comes the Marshall Plan. Can Stalin effectively block it? So let's have a look at what Stalin has seen in the past 3 years. He's seen the suppression of communist revolutions in Greece and Turkey, the United States taking the lead in that by supplying them with the money and the weapons they need to do it. He has seen the proclamation of the Truman Doctrine in 1947, at which the United States commits itself to containment, that's the next declaration, containment of communist aggression as they see it throughout the globe. Stalin has also seen $13 billion put toward the capitalist development of Western Europe. From Stalin's perspective, what's going to happen next? And remember Stalin's old fear. What does he most fear? He fears for his security. So let's take a closer look at the map of Europe following World War II. Germany, which was defeated at the conclusion of the war, is going to be divided into 4 zones of occupation. And there they are to the right. Each zone is going to be occupied by one of the Allies: Britain, France, the USA, and the Soviet Union. And each ally is going to take charge of the development of that particular zone and help toward the full integration of Germany back into the European mainstream and the European economy. Now Berlin, take a look at where Berlin is. Berlin, the capital city, is likewise going to be divided into 4 zones, and each of those zones is going to be governed by one of the allies. Now look at Berlin on the map. Berlin is located deep within the Soviet zone. So you're going to have a divided city within the Soviet zone of influence. Berlin is an island of democracy and an island of Western-oriented capitalism inside the Soviet zone. So here's a closer look at who's controlling which parts of Berlin. Berlin is going to be partitioned. In 1946, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union are each going to take a part. And so in 1948, Joseph Stalin makes an aggressive move toward Berlin. He believes it is a bone of the throat of the Soviet Union. It's an outpost, an offensive outpost of the West, in what he believes should be Soviet territory. So in June of 1948, he organizes his armies, and he sends them to blockade all of Berlin. That's to let nothing in or out. Railway, auto, air traffic, all of it will be permitted inside of the city of West Berlin. Water and power is also going to be shut down by the communists blockading the city. The idea here is to force West Berlin, that is the Allied zone of West Berlin, into the Soviet sphere. Also, test the West. How is she going to respond? Is she going to respond at all? Is this going to be the outset of World War III? Well, with the Soviets blockading West Berlin, we look once again to tough call Truman. Now Truman, he's got some options. One, let's try to talk it out. Let's get a diplomatic solution to this crisis. Two, just give up West Berlin. Some of his advisors think this is the wisest thing to do. After all, how can we possibly maintain a democratic and capitalist portion of a city deep within the Soviet sphere? It's unreasonable, they tell him. How about this? Go to war over the whole thing. After all, a blockade is an act of war. Joseph Stalin started it, and so why don't we do it? We've got the angle, we've got the edge, we've got the atomic bomb. He'll back down, right? Well, Truman decides one thing's for sure. We're not leaving. We shall stay. Period, says Truman. Tough Call Truman says, no, we're not going to go to war. We're not going to give up the city, and negotiating isn't my style. So here's how this is going to happen. We're going to fly in whatever West Berlin needs and keep it from calling to the communists. They need food, they need water, they need clothing, they need whatever it is. We're going to put it onto planes and we're going to drop it off or fly it in. The United States is going to conduct over 300,000 flights. Bombers are going to be equipped with this stuff, and they're going to go in and out of West Berlin between June of 1948 and May of 1949. A plane is going to land in West Berlin every 30 seconds, all the while bringing the much-needed supplies that the West Berliners need to stay alive and to keep from looking to the communists. Here's a map of how that looks, as you can see. They're taking off from the sections of Germany which are controlled by the other Western Democratic allies. And these round-the-clock missions are going to be dropping off the much-needed supplies that the West Berliners need to stay alive. And Tough Call Truman made the right call, because in the spring of 1949, Stalin apparently decided it wasn't worth the effort, saw that the United States was willing to continue to send in the supplies that the West Berliners need, and he backed down. A woman who was there recalls in 1996, sheer joy, nothing else, joy, and the feeling that we have done it, and it works. That was so very important. The West has won. I say this quite deliberately in such a crass way because you wanted to know how I felt emotionally. The West, well, we have succeeded. The West has won, and the others, she means Stalin and the Soviet system, have not. Another thing to notice, too, is that Stalin, it seemed, did not want to risk an all-out war with the United States either. He made a move. He wanted to see how the United States was going to respond. The United States did not give up the city and, in fact, turned the Soviets out. Well, here's another side of the Berlin airlift. It costs money in order to do this sort of operation. It costs money to land a loaded B-29 bomber in Europe every 30 seconds. And so the way the U.S. government is going to deal with this cost is it's going to give U.S. companies defense contracts. What that means is that the federal government is going to put forward the company, and the private industry is going to do the work and do the profiting. There's going to be planes that are needed. There's going to be equipment that's needed. There's oil that's needed. We need diapers, farm produce. We need water. We need pet food. We need milk. Welcome to the new economy. President Eisenhower, who's going to come into office in 1952, is going to call this the military-industrial complex. This is the cooperation between the military, the government, the federal government, and also the private industry that is going to do a lot of this work. Take a look at the advertisement on the right. It says milk, the new weapon of democracy. What does this mean? This means that the United States government has given a defense contract to these dairy producers, and these dairy producers are suddenly doing the work that soldiers would have done. This is a new way of waging war. Private industry is going to be doing the work that the federal government needs in order to fight communism. And this is why you're going to see a huge economic boom from the 1950s all the way into the 1970s. Germany by 1955 has been abandoned by the other Western democracies, and it collapses into two zones. West Berlin, controlled by the United States, or rather sponsored by the United States and lifted up by the United States, and East Germany, which is going to be controlled by the Soviet Union. Following the Berlin crisis, the United States calls on Western democratic nations to form a new military alliance. It's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO for short, formed 1 year after the Berlin crisis in 1949. You've got a lot of Western democratic nations that are going to participate. Of course, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Greece and Turkey, West Germany, just to name a few. They are in a pact, a pact together. An armed attack against one or more member nations, reads the NATO Pact of 1949, shall be considered an attack against all of them. Not to be outdone, the Soviet Union puts together the Warsaw Pact in 1955. And this is less of an empire by invitation and more of an empire by coercion because, as you recall, Hungary and Poland, Romania, East Germany, they're not allowed to leave the Soviet sphere, as Hungary is going to find out in just 1 year from now. But ostensibly, this is the same thing to serve the same purpose. It's a military alliance in which an attack on one is considered to be an attack on all of them. And I hope you remember from your world history class that in 1949, China became a communist nation and really takes the world, especially the Western world, by surprise. Right under our noses, the world's most populous nation turns to communism. Now, this was, of course, the result of a very long and bitter civil war. And when Mao Zedong announces that the People's Republic of China is joining the ranks of Marxist nations in the planet, it really causes Americans to panic. Who let this happen? Who gave away China, so to speak? Now, America's reasoning in the 1950s is that, well, the USSR is a communist nation and China is also a communist nation, and so they must be working together. They must be receiving, both of them must be receiving their marching orders directly from Moscow. In reality, the USSR and China are both oriented toward Marxism, toward a communist way of thinking, but they have conflicting visions on how to interpret the Marxist program. Now, Chairman Mao Zedong of China is certainly not interested in taking his orders from Moscow. He sees himself as the leader of his own independent, strong and independent communist nation. But America believes, and America is going to continue in the belief, that everybody who leans a little bit to the left is part of a worldwide communist conspiracy being directed from Moscow, and they must be put down. Now, as with all of these, sort of mythologies, there's a little bit of truth to it, of course. But most of the nations, such as Vietnam, such as North Korea, that are going to adopt the communist program in the years to come, are more oriented toward nationalism. And they're simply going to be appealing to whichever superpower they think is going to give them the greatest resources to do that. And so America is thinking everybody's taking their orders from Moscow, but in fact, there's a lot more tension and there's a lot more argument within the communist world than America yet realizes. And it's not going to be until the Nixon administration that we realize that we can sort of play them against each other and work them to our advantage. Looking at here, the Korean Peninsula. Now, Japan had conquered the Korean Peninsula and made it part of its co-prosperity sphere during the Second World War. In 1945, after the Second World War has ended, the United States and the Soviet Union decided to divide Korea as they had divided Berlin at the 38th parallel, which you can see in front of you right there. Now, as with Berlin, or as with Germany, the U.S. is going to install a non-communist government in the South under the leadership of a Korean named Syngman Rhee. As you would expect, the Soviets are going to install a communist government in the North under the leadership of a man named Kim Sung-il. What could possibly go wrong with a divided peninsula? So we tell ourselves. Here's what goes wrong. In June of 1950, 90,000 North Korean communist soldiers pour across the 38th parallel in an attempt to reunite by force the Korean peninsula under a single communist government. Of course, the United States is going to respond to this. President Truman goes before the American people shortly after the invasion and says on television, "This attack has made it clear, beyond all doubt, that the international communist movement is willing to use armed invasion to conquer independent nations. An act of aggression such as this creates a very real danger to the security of all free nations. The free nations have now made it clear that lawless aggression will be met with force. The free nations have learned the fateful lesson of the 1930s. That lesson is that aggression must be met firmly. Appeasement only leads to further aggression and ultimately to war." So a couple of things that I want you to pick up on here. Truman is a believer in the international communist movement, and he is interpreting this action as a movement of a monolithic communist force that is operating and emanating from Moscow. Now, yes, of course, Moscow has skin in the game, but the North Koreans are actually nationalists before they want to be Russians. And what they are doing, and what the communist leaders in North Korea are doing, is they are using the Soviet Union as a means to maintain funding and to receive support. They are not interested, however, in becoming part of the Soviet sphere. Another thing I want you to see is that Truman is seeing events through the memory of Munich of 1938, in which Czechoslovakia was simply given up to Hitler in the hopes that Hitler would stop making further territorial claims. Now, whether this is a fair analogy or not has been the source of a lot of contention among historians. But Truman clearly believes that it is, and he's making it clear there will be no appeasement here. I am not simply going to give up South Korea in hopes that the international communist movement is done with making territorial demands. So let's continue to trace the development of the Korean War following the invasion of the South by the North in June of 1950. The North Koreans capture Seoul, that's the capital city of the South, and they set out in pursuit of the retreating South Korean army, pushing them all the way to the sea. Now, General MacArthur arrives with troops from the United Nations from Japan, and this is in November of 1950. He does a tremendous job of pushing the North across the 38th parallel and beyond. But look how close he's getting. He's pushing very, very close to the boundaries of China near the Yalu River. This makes China very nervous. China had sent warning that she would not tolerate any kind of U.S. or UN aggression, as she called it, anywhere near its borders, and would respond with force. And so, in July 27, she does just that. As Mao Zedong grows nervous about this approach, he counterattacks with 300,000 Chinese troops who send the UN into retreat. Now, there's a couple of ways to interpret this move. Chairman Mao says, "I simply don't want UN troops near my borders. I don't want anyone threatening my sovereignty," and he seems to mean it. From the United States' point of view, this is part of the international communist conspiracy in which one hive mind, in Moscow presumably, are directing the movements of all the others. The United States is going to misinterpret this for quite some time and is going to assume that everybody is taking their orders from Stalin and then from whoever the premier is in Moscow. In fact, these are independent nations that share an ideology but squabble bitterly with each other about how to develop that ideology and who is the actual leader of the communist world. Well, once the Chinese have counterattacked and pushed the UN forces all the way back to roughly where they started at the 38th parallel, Truman has to meet with his Chief General MacArthur. Now, you recall, MacArthur is a genuine American hero responsible for the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific, which eventually led to the blockading and surrounding of the island of Japan. MacArthur says to Truman, "I want to take this war to China. I want to widen the war, and let's end this here." And he even goes as far as to say he would like Truman to authorize the use of atomic weapons against China, and then he assumes Russia. Truman is not willing to go this far. The hell you say, General MacArthur. We are not going to widen this war. As his advisors tell him, this would be the wrong war, the wrong place, the wrong time. They believe that the greater threat is going to be coming from Europe, and we should leave the Asian theater alone for now. So at the war's conclusion, you have more or less the same divided Korea that you had at the beginning. It did not end with Truman, but with his successor, the Republican president, Dwight D. Eisenhower. President Eisenhower helped to negotiate a settlement, a ceasefire, not actually a treaty, near the 38th line of parallel, which, as you recall, is precisely where the war began. Today, the North remains communist and the South remains a democratic republic, a non-communist democratic republic. As I said, the end was an armistice, not a treaty. Technically, the two are still at war. The 38th parallel today is one of the world's hotspots. It's one of the world's heavily militarized zones, one of those places where we're just not sure what's going to happen. But the Korean War changed America a lot more than it changed Korea. Let's look at the reasons. Consequences of the Korean War are varied. First, it changed the balance of power between Congress and the military. How's this? Look at what Truman did. Truman ordered troops into war on his own authority. Congress had given these war powers to his predecessor, Franklin Roosevelt, called the War Powers Acts of 1941 and 1942, which widened the ability of the president, expanded the powers of the president to wage war without congressional approval. Another thing that it did is the war expanded the American presence in Asia. We had been in Japan, and now we have expanded to the South Korean peninsula, and we're not just going to leave. Containment, the policy that we should be containing or stopping communist aggression anywhere on the planet, truly became a worldwide police action. And it makes our transition to Vietnam seem much easier and much more natural. It also resulted in a constitutional struggle between the military, or part of the military, and the President Truman himself. So what does the Constitution say about the military, about control of the military? Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution states that Congress shall have the power to, quote, raise and support armies, and to, quote, provide and maintain a navy. In addition, Congress must provide for the state militias when they are called to federal service. So, Congress has the power. Well, General MacArthur begins to blur those lines a little bit and begins to make some statements that are quite frankly, out of line for a constitutional republic in which the military is under civilian control. In a letter to one of his friends in Congress, he writes, "It seems seemingly difficult for some to realize that here in Asia is where the communist conspirators have elected to make their play for global conquest, and that we have joined the issue thus raised on the battlefield. That here we fight Europe's war with arms, while the diplomatic, they still fight it with words. That if we lose the war to communism in Asia, the fall of Europe is inevitable. Win it, and Europe most probably would avoid war and yet preserve freedom. There is no substitute for victory." Now, what MacArthur is doing here is he's directly criticizing Harry Truman's policy not to expand the war, not to move on to China and perhaps the Soviet Union, and even his decision not to use atomic weapons in Asia. Now, this is out of line for a military commander. Now, as a private citizen, a man can have any opinion he wants. He can vote any way he wants. He can do any of that. As a representative of the U.S. Armed Forces, you do not have a political opinion. You do not get to speak out against the president or your commanding officers while you wear that uniform. And I, for one, believe that this is a good tradition. We need to maintain this tradition because we are a constitutional republic ruled by the people, not a military republic ruled by the military. Now, Truman and MacArthur had often butted heads before, but MacArthur had not gone so far as to publicly bash the president and put it in writing. And so when Truman learns of MacArthur's insubordinance, Truman uses his constitutional duty and fires him, relieves him of duty. Later, he told Time magazine, "I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, although he was. But that's not against the law for generals. If it was, half to three-quarters of them would be in jail." So Truman getting a little bit cheeky with Time magazine there, but he fired MacArthur because MacArthur would not respect the chain of command and did not respect his place. MacArthur had presidential ambitions at this time. He wanted to be drafted by the Republican Party as the presidential nominee in 1952, and this is all over now. We recall the deficit spending in which the United States engaged in order to pay for World War II. Deficit spending, you recall, is writing an IOU to the future and hoping that our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren will somehow be able to pay off the money that we've been spending. So look at how high this spending got during the Second World War, its peak in 1944, 1945. And then look at how it drops precipitously. So there's the peak of World War I. We're doing a whole lot of spending. In millions of dollars, you've got 80,000 up there. That's the Korean War right there, 1952. It begins to spike once again. And this is upwards and upwards toward Vietnam. So look at where we were in 1940. Now look at where we are in 1964. Do we ever actually return to a peacetime economy? Have we returned to a peacetime economy today? Well, here is the U.S. national defense outlays in billions of dollars. In 1947, at the beginning of the announcement of the Truman Doctrine, the United States is putting forward $13 billion in defense outlays. By 1952, when President Eisenhower comes into office, the United States is spending twice that, $26 billion. By 1957, when Sputnik is launched, we're spending $45 billion. Where's all this money coming from, you may ask? In September of 1949, an American B-29 spy plane, which is flying over Alaska, which, as you recall, is very close to the former Soviet Union, detects a cloud of radiation drifting eastward from Siberia. Now, this is really bad news for the United States because that much radiation drifting from Siberia can only mean one thing, and that's the Soviet Union has successfully detonated its first atomic bomb. And now atomic parity has now been reached between the United States and the Soviet Union. In other words, we no longer have the upper hand in the Cold War. In response, President Truman orders the Atomic Energy Commission of the federal government to up their game. Now that the Soviet Union has detonated the first atomic bomb, he says, I want us to develop a hydrogen bomb. Well, what is that? Let's start looking at the comparisons. This would be the Trinity explosion, which happened in the New Mexico desert by the Manhattan Project in order to see if such a reaction was possible. This would be the Hiroshima explosion, which was slightly smaller but devastating in its effects. Now, a hydrogen bomb would look something like this in comparison. It is 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb, and so the race to develop it is on. So in 1952, the United States did it. They successfully detonated the first hydrogen bomb. Not to be outdone, the USSR detonated its first hydrogen bomb in 1953. And so the arms race begins. In the next decade, the US and the USSR are going to develop and stockpile increasingly powerful nuclear weapons, and they're going to arm planes, submarines, and missiles with these nuclear weapons. This is a policy known as MAD, or Mutually Assured Destruction. You see, it's based on the belief that nuclear weapons are so horrible and so powerful and so destructive that neither superpower, neither the USA or the USSR, would dare to use them because it would mean the fiery end of civilization as we know it. MAD. Mutually Assured Destruction. It's a deterrent. In other words, if nuclear weapons are so destructive, why would anybody use them? But we certainly do begin to prepare for war like we're going to use them. Let's look at where China is. China has one nuclear warhead and develops one nuclear warhead between 1945 and 1965. France develops 4. England develops 310. The USSR develops 6,129. So that's a pretty scary number. Look at the United States. Goes way off the screen. 31,642. So we have way more than the Soviet Union ever has. Now, U.S. intelligence is not actually aware of this disparity. Up until 1960, it is widely believed that there is a missile gap between the United States and the Soviet Union. That's what John F. Kennedy tells us in his election campaign, is that there's a missile gap. The Soviet Union is beating us. They have far more warheads than we do. In fact, just the opposite is true. The United States has far more warheads than the Soviet Union ever had and ever will. In 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower, formerly General Eisenhower of World War II, is elected the first Republican president since 1928, since Herbert Hoover was elected. And of course, we look at the Solid South, and the Solid South is continuing to vote Democrat, saying we will never vote for Republican. But Dwight David Eisenhower is not exactly a return to the 20s style president. He is extremely moderate. Can you say that? Extremely moderate? He's not right-wing. He's not left-wing. In fact, the Democrats had courted Dwight Eisenhower to be their running mate before he said, no, I'm not interested. And then he thought better of it and says, I'm back in. And by then the Democrats had found their guy. And he says, well, I'll just join with the Republicans. So he wants to continue with the policy of containment, but he also wants to make members of his party happy and scale down the spending. Now, Eisenhower is going to put forward what becomes known as the domino theory. He says, you have broader considerations that might follow what you would call the falling domino principle. You have a row of dominoes set up, you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is certainly that it will go over very quickly. So you could have a beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influences. Of course, he's talking about the spread of communism throughout the world. And he believes that if one nation goes communist, its neighbor is just as likely to go communist, and its neighbor is just as likely to go communist, and its neighbor is just as likely to go communist, and so on, until the communist influence reaches all the way across the globe, perhaps to the United States. And so Eisenhower's domino theory suggests that the United States must keep the first domino from falling. So this is an extension of containment in a way. Yes, we're going to contain communism, but he adds to this saying that we must contain communism because it will simply spread if we do not. Well, this gives rise to the inevitable question, how do I continue to fight a global war on communism while I keep taxes low and government costs under control? Well, Eisenhower has an idea, and he calls it his new look. Here's how we're going to do this, he says. We're going to have fewer troops, because troops you have to feed, you have to clothe them, you have to pay them salaries, you have to pay them pensions. They're very expensive to maintain. Now, on the other hand, we'll have more bombs, bigger bombs, because they don't ask for much. In order to pursue his new look, Eisenhower is going to appoint John Foster Dulles as his Secretary of State. Dulles is a true believer in the doctrine of containment. Communism must be stopped wherever it rears its head. He is also a true believer in the domino theory, believing that if one nation is allowed to go communist, it will not be too long before the next nation goes, and the next nation goes, and the next nation goes. He's the architect of the new look. He wants to give the United States a bigger bang for the buck, and so he initiates a policy known as massive retaliation. He succeeded. The U.S. arsenal of nuclear weapons increased, and believe it or not, the defense budget in 1953, when Eisenhower comes into office, was $50.5 billion. By 1955, the defense budget has dropped to $35.8 billion, and so Eisenhower has kept his promise. We're going to be tough on the communists, we're going to build up our arsenal, and we're also going to bring down spending. John Foster Dulles says a potential aggressor must know that he cannot always prescribe battle conditions to suit him. The way to deter aggression is for the free community, that is the United States and its allies, to be willing and able to correspond vigorously at places and with the means of his choosing. In other words, we've got to be willing to go all the way with this nuclear threat that we're carrying out. This is known as brinksmanship. We must push ourselves, be willing to push ourselves to the total brink of disaster in order to show the Soviets that we mean business. Better dead than red, in other words. Well, soon enough, brinksmanship shows its limitations, such as in 1956, where Hungarian students led an open rebellion against Soviet rule. You'll recall that Hungary is part of the Soviet sphere, not allowed to be let go. These students, as you can see on the right, toppled a statue of Joseph Stalin and demanded an end to censorship. They wanted to replace Soviet puppet leaders with popularly elected leaders, and they wanted non-communist political parties to be allowed to function. Well, the new Soviet premier, his name is Nikita Khrushchev, responds very swiftly by sending in the tanks and sending in the troops and crushing the rebellion with force. Now, here it seems that part of the Soviet Empire crumbled on its own accord and waved the flag of freedom to the United States. Help us out, we're ready. Well, under brinksmanship, what is the United States equipped to do? Under Eisenhower's new look, what can the United States do? Can we send you a nuclear bomb? Can we just drop the thing? We are ill-equipped to deal with small-scale disasters or small-scale conflicts within the struggle against communism. Not everybody is going to align themselves with either the Soviet Union or the United States during the Cold War. Some of them, such as Gamal Abdel Nasser, are going to play the superpowers against each other for their own benefit. So Nasser wants to build a dam on the Aswan River. Well, Great Britain and France, two Western democratic nations, offer to fund it. But then Nasser makes a move. He publicly recognizes the People's Republic of China, which is a communist nation, and then he begins to open talks with the Soviet Union about funding his dam project. Not his dam project, but his dam project. Well, immediately, what is Eisenhower and his Joint Chiefs of Staff thinking in the United States? Egypt is going communist. Why else would they be doing this? Well, Nasser then takes the next move and nationalizes the Suez Canal. That is, he puts it under government control. Essentially, he socializes it. Now, this signals to the United States that Egypt is moving further to the west, or further to the left, I'm sorry, not the west, but the left, and is beginning to take overtures to become more of a communist-oriented nation. It has been managed, that is, the Suez Canal, has been managed by an Anglo-French company and protected by British troops. Nasser sends them packing. Goodbye, imperialists, he tells them. Well, Britain and France decide this is their time to intervene militarily in Egypt by putting the canal back in Western hands. Now, they don't consult the USA when they do this, but they do count on the US coming to their aid. So they hope for US support. But they know that the US is going to be hesitant to directly oppose a nation that is friendly with China and the USSR. Well, President Eisenhower was completely taken by surprise by England and France's aggression against Egypt. You see, he had just condemned the suppression of the anti-imperialists in Hungary in 1956, and now he's being asked to put down an independence movement in the Middle East. Sound a little bit contradictory, leader of the free world, Mr. Eisenhower? Well, he takes the only course that's really available to him if he's going to hold his head up in the free world again. He condemns England and France for their hostility towards Egypt. And just to show the Soviets that he's serious about this, he bars the export of oils to his Western allies, to England and France, who are going to need it in order to wage war, because they're not able to get it through the Suez Canal anymore. Well, England and France, without the oil that they need to maintain a war effort against Egypt, are forced to withdraw. And so Nasser wins. How did he do this? He knew that the U.S. would not risk a war with the USSR, and thus they would not support Britain and France when Britain and France threatened to put the Suez Canal back under Western hands. Now, Nasser really didn't have any interest in falling under the heels of the Soviet Union. What he did have an interest in doing was keeping the U.S. out of this conflict, and he succeeded quite admirably, I should say. Well, in order to save face, President Eisenhower issues what is known as the Eisenhower Doctrine in 1958. It reads, "The President will authorize such assistance and cooperation to include the employment of the armed forces of the United States to secure and protect the territorial integrity and political independence of such nations, requesting such aid against overt armed aggression from any nation controlled by," and there's that word again, international communism. So in other words, he realizes he's been had. He realizes he's been played by a so-called third world nation, somebody in the global south, and by playing the Soviets and the United States against them, and by not really seeking to align themselves with either one. So in response to that, he toughens up and he issues the Eisenhower Doctrine, which essentially extends the Truman Doctrine and extends the policy of containment to what we call today the Middle East. We'll be there as well. Oh no, I say, terrible news. On October 4, 1957, Americans wake up to realize that the USSR, the Soviet Union, has successfully launched an 84-pound steel ball called Sputnik 1 into space, and it has achieved orbit and is circling over the entire planet, including the United States, as Americans can watch. Sputnik 1 transmitted a beeping sound incessantly from orbit, and it really freaked Americans out. It went beep, 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 and Soviet or NASA engineers and intelligence people tried to figure out what it meant, spent millions of dollars trying to crack the code. It turns out it was just beeping to let everybody know it was still there. But nevertheless, national panic spreads throughout the nation. If the Soviets can put a satellite into space, then they can surely equip those satellites with missiles, and those missiles can launch themselves at our country. I love this cartoon, which has got Uncle Sam sitting bolt upright in bed as Sputnik beeps outside his window, and what's written on his bed is complacency. Down below, awake at last. And then on November 11th, 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, which is a larger and more advanced satellite. And you can see a little dog inside Sputnik 2, right? Sputnik 2 was designed to stay in orbit longer than Sputnik 1's 92 days. And as I said, and I pointed out to you, Sputnik 2 had a passenger, a small dog named Laika. Now, she was to test space effects on living beings, but unfortunately for Laika, this is a one-way trip. She wasn't expected to return, and she dies in orbit. So the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union is on. Congress quickly approves $1 billion additional dollars for the National Defense Education Act, because we've got to equip the schools, you see, to train rocket scientists and space engineers. I love the Life magazine periodical to your right, Education in Crisis. It leads, you see, education is always in crisis. That's a good way to get votes, is to declare that education is in crisis. And look at the kid on the left. Look at that scowling Russian guy with that furry hat on. And look at the happy-go-lucky American teen right next to him on the right. Who's going to win the race, I'm asking you? Who's hardened for war? We Americans better get our act together. Get teacher training programs to improve math and science instruction in the public schools. This is what we need. Congress then creates the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, known to you as NASA. Still around today, that's right. It's to coordinate efforts between scientists and the military to catch up to supposed Soviet superiority. Now, whereas the Soviet program was owned and operated by the government, as all things are in the Soviet Union, Eisenhower was very careful to keep NASA a private organization out of the control of the military. The military cooperates, but does not tell NASA what to do. Eisenhower is very careful to make sure we do not militarize the United States as the Soviet Union or as North Korea has militarized. Just glancing ahead, the United States eventually does come out ahead in the moon landing of 1969. More to be said about that when we reach the Kennedy administration.